Welcome back. With corruption evident in many aspects of South African society, is it any wonder that the country is coming out tops when it comes to promoting openness and accountability? Countries that did well are South Africa and France, and Hong Kong being one of the lowest. A report released by DLA Piper notes employers must be aware of the issues of wrongdoing in the workplace and outlines the challenges for global employers seeking to minimize the risks to their business. It also identifies that international employers need to take a global approach to managing whistleblowing effectively, and that companies need to be aware of the sharp contrasts in culture when jurisdictions, so that they can tailor their approach to meet the demands of their global business. Well, joining me live in studio is the Director in the Employment Sector at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr, Mr. Hugo Pienaar. Thank you very much for joining us, Hugo.
Thank you.
First of all, how does South Africa actually rate in a global context when it comes to whistleblowing?
We're doing exceptionally well in terms of legislation. In fact, we rate it among the tops. We're similar to the UK legislation, so on par with the US legislation, and of course the same with China and Japan, and those are all the top-rated countries. And we're rated exactly at the same rate as those four top countries.
We're talking about legislation here. How does that differ from the real on-the-ground number of whistleblowers who are coming forward?
Yeah. Well, our legislation is good, as we've indicated. The difficulty is, of course, how do you get the people to come forward and to disclose? And it depends on the country's culture. We've seen in the whistleblowers report that it depends, one of the factors would be the country's culture. And the same with our country. There's sadly a lot of protection for fellow employees at the workplace, for instance, and you've seen that at different levels, whether at company level or to other corporate levels, maybe at government level. You've seen that sort of protection. So you want, on the one side, you want to encourage whistleblowing and ensure that there is proper protection. The history has shown there's a lot of reported cases, Chantal, in our country on whistleblowers who reported, who received the necessary protection. But of course there's also abuse of the Act, where people have used whistleblowing or the Act itself as a sort of a retaliation against the employer. So on the one side you want the protection, you want to create a culture of disclosure, but employees must know that if they do make the disclosure, that they're properly protected.
Have we seen more and more whistleblowers coming to the fore over the years? Is it something that South Africans have to get used to, that concept?
Yeah, I would think that is. Certainly not enough, but we've seen cases coming forward. Most of the reported cases, not necessarily most of them, but we see many of those reported cases being unsuccessful, where the employee wants to achieve some sort of protection, but simply because the employee has, for instance, not complied with the minimum legislation, or has it used it for personal gain, or it wasn't a bona fide protection, protected disclosure that the employee made.
So it's somewhat ironic that we have wonderful legislation when it comes to whistleblowing, and yet we have some of the highest corruption rates in the world. How do the two balance out?
It's part of our culture of protection of fellow culprits, so to speak, at the workplace and otherwise. And at senior level, people share, so they're not necessarily encouraged to share the information. When somebody is excluded from a particular deal, or a deal goes sour, then you see disclosure. When a junior employee exposes, it's mostly, or sadly mostly in cases of retaliation. And when there is a genuine disclosure, we see the protection. But you know, Chantal, the reality is that it's not a career advancement move, and it's in fact quite career limiting. So employees are wary of that and sometimes reluctant for that reason. But we have the protection, and we've seen in cases that we've certainly dealt with where there's an abuse, that the company has also some sort of protection. And the general rule there is that you would do the investigation, and if the employees can't substantiate the allegations, then there's a further investigation and a possible dismissal, as we've seen in a high-level case about 2 or 3 years ago in a listed company, where 6 executives did a so-called protected disclosure, and they all lost their employment. Of course, that sends another message to the market, which you don't necessarily want to.
It certainly does, and it also raises the question, do you think that companies protect themselves from external crime and spend fortunes on external security systems, but seldom consider the danger that lies within with their own employees?
Yeah. Well, it's a danger if the employees do not disclose. You actually want them to disclose, but it's actually, so you want that on the one side. On the other side, and there's a duty to disclose. If they do not want to disclose, how do we incentivize them? In some US legislation, there's a share almost of the proceeds of the report between 10 and 30% if an employee makes that report. But we don't have that in our legislation.
So incentive would be a good way to bring whistleblowers to the fore.
That would be one way of doing it. Of course, you may then question the bona fides of the whistleblower because it could only be for personal gain, and our legislation specifically prohibits that. So one will have to revise those provisions in the Act if you want that.
Hugo, do we ever face a case of whistleblowers wanting to come forward, but they fear victimization, they fear that it might leak out, they fear that they might in turn be hunted?
Oh yes, because many companies have a hotline, and even where they use a hotline and it would be done on an anonymous basis, they still fear that, and then obviously they're reluctant to come forward. Yes, it happens.
So what do you think is the best way of proceeding with whistleblowing in South Africa? It is something that's needed. It is something that could certainly combat the ongoing crime and corruption that takes place. What is the best way to proceed?
Well, certainly we need to create a culture of disclosing of dishonest conduct, not only in company level, but at every level of the society. Part of it for companies would be to establish a hotline. Of course, we've seen when you deal with international companies, they must be wary of whether they act in the US environment or the European environment, where it's a totally different ballgame as opposed to some countries in the East. But the internationals in our country, most of them have some sort of hotline. The locals not necessarily so, but one would encourage them to use that as a starting point, and then have a code of ethics, have a code where we employ a designated employer to make employees aware that they're safe, almost similar to the designated employer in the Employment Equity Act. We have this designated person. He will then ensure protection for the employees, but it's also addressed at a high level, and employees are trained and be made aware of this, together with a code of ethics, which we should have in any event.
How does a whistleblower know that they're protected? What guarantees are there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's probably safe to take advice to understand what constitutes a disclosure, to whom you should make that disclosure, and that it is indeed protected. And then you simply follow the procedures, because in most cases a company would have a procedure, or should have a procedure, where you would do the protected disclosure. It would be internally. If there's some exceptions to the rule where you don't have to do the report internally and go directly externally. But I should think that the employee or whoever wants to make the disclosure should first ensure that they understand the nature of it and the protective framework. Of course, there's also protection in terms of the Companies Act. It's not just the the Whistleblowers Act or the so-called Protected Disclosure Act that provides for protection.
We see South Africa's done very well in terms of legislation when it comes to whistleblowing. Hong Kong didn't do very well. Why is that? What's the difference between the two?
I think it's almost like in some countries you don't need legislation because you have a sort of a corporate culture, or a culture of, I'm not saying it's necessarily the case there, but a culture of honest conduct, to do and to know what is right, not to spit in the street, for instance. There's that corporate culture or global or culture in the country. It's almost like a corporate soul of a company. So you would have that. And sometimes it's not necessary to legislate. In fact, it would be great to work in or to operate in an environment with little legislation and people comply voluntarily and do what is right, because it's so simple.
Well, it sounds as if it's as simple as that, doesn't it? That it's just a simple choice about doing what is right as opposed to doing what is wrong. But we've seen in South Africa that the moral fibre is certainly questionable from time to time, and there's so much collusion when it comes to corruption that people really do take a risk when they decide to whistleblow on syndicates and groups of people who are involved in corruption.
Yes, there is. We don't have similar protection as in the US for people to take up a different identity and all of that, because certainly that's what you will need in certain circumstances. We don't have that.
We have no witness protection programs.
Well, we have, but it's not as advanced as we would have in the US. But you would first want a corporate culture where people would say no go to any form of dishonesty. I mean, isn't that the first prize? But of course, if you don't have that and people start disclosing this fear of their life and otherwise, it's not really an incentive. If my life is at risk, it's almost like during our strike season. People do not necessarily agree to go on a strike, but fear of life would leave them at home. And the same here, fear of life and retaliation would leave people not to make a disclosure.
Well, Hugo, that's certainly something to contemplate, and something which South Africans certainly have to look at from an introspective level. Thank you so much for joining us here on ANN7 Prime. Well, that was the Director in the Employment Sector at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr, Mr. Hugo Pienaar. Coming up after the break, plans to sue construction companies off the back of collusion are gaining momentum. Stay tuned to ANN7 Prime.